I arrived 5 minutes early on a Friday night in Chicago. River North still loud outside. Cars slowing at lights. People crossing fast. Coats brushing past each other. The restaurant sitting on the corner exactly where the map said it would be. Maison Aurel. Gold lettering against glass. Steady light. No flicker. No movement. Alyssa stood beside me and adjusted her jacket once. Then stopped. I straightened my cuffs. The same motion I've done 100 times without thinking. We had a reservation. 2 weeks ahead. Confirmed by email. Nothing complicated. Nothing unusual. I pulled the door open, and a small bell rang. Sharp and clean. Inside, the room opened evenly. Warm light spread across white tablecloths. No dark corners. Spacing precise. Silverware touching plates in small sounds. Glasses meeting wood. A piano playing low notes at a slow pace without urgency. The host looked up. Her eyes paused for a beat, then lifted into a practiced smile. Name. 1 word. I said it clearly, without rushing. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. Dry clicks. Efficient. The couple ahead of us finished their check-in in about 30 seconds and were already being guided away. Then it was our turn. The screen brightened and stayed bright. Her hands stopped moving. Not long, just longer than before. She leaned down, pulled out a printed list, and turned 1 page. Please wait. 2 words. I nodded and stepped aside. We stood closer to the entrance. Under stronger light, near the door, the couple behind us glanced over once, then returned to their phones. No one spoke. I checked my watch. T. On 6 p.m. A minute passed, and nothing changed. The door opened again, and 3 people entered, said their names, and walked past us without stopping. I checked my watch again. C. Archery. 3 minutes. Not long, not short. A table near the center received food. Steam, lifting slowly. Butter warm in the air. A server placed the plates. Nodded. And stepped back. Napkins stayed folded. Candles didn't move. We remained standing. The host returned and said, "Sorry for the delay." Nothing followed. No reason. No estimate. I nodded again and didn't ask. Alyssa's fingers touched my wrist lightly, then withdrew. The host turned back to the screen, typed again, and stopped. Right this way. 4 words. She turned without widening her gesture. And we followed. We passed the center aisle where empty tables were visible. Unused. Near the windows. White cloths untouched. Glasses waiting. We didn't stop. She turned right toward the service corridor. The kitchen doors opened and closed. Metal sounds slipping out. A cart rolled past. Wheels humming softly. She pulled out a chair and placed the menus down. Here you go. Then she left. No explanation. No pause. I sat. The chair was firm. Alyssa sat across from me and smiled briefly. Only for me. I opened the menu. Thick paper. Sharp print. Long descriptions. High prices. No images. Behind me, silverware clinked. A tray slid, and voices overlapped. A table farther back laughed loudly without interruption. I checked my watch. C. Archer Wu. A server walked by and didn't stop. Across the room, a manager stood, speaking quietly to staff. His eyes moving. Passing our table for 1 second before shifting away. Alyssa turned pages, front to back, and spoke calmly. Asking what looked good. The sentence stayed short. I haven't answered yet. I looked around. The table beside us had arrived later and was already ordering. The server leaned in, pen moving quickly, head nodding. I closed the menu and set it down. The server returned to us and asked about drinks. I ordered water. Alyssa did too. He nodded and left immediately. The water arrived fast. Cold glass. Ice, full. The glass touched the table with a clear sound. I held it and didn't drink. The table surface was spotless. The cloth flat. Edges straight. Everything followed design. Lighting. Music. Spacing. Timing. All appeared correct. Something still sat off-center. Unnamed. No one raised a voice. No sharp looks lingered. No gestures held. Just waiting. Just placement. Just sequence. I checked my watch again. Century. 6 minutes. Not dramatic. Not invisible. Another table received entrees. Plates set carefully. And a knife touched porcelain once. I exhaled slowly. Alyssa set her glass down with a soft tap and kept her posture steady. Back straight. Shoulders level. No one looked at us now. No one avoided us either. We were present. Clearly. But not addressed. I noticed the order without forming conclusions. Who arrived? Who moved? Who stood? Who sat? Who waited? Who was guided? I didn't say anything. I checked my watch again. And it was still the same minute. A server passed once more and still didn't stop. The kitchen doors opened again and closed again. The cart rolled back with the same sound. A table near the entrance filled as guests removed coats. Chairs scraping lightly without correction. Another group entered, spoke their name, and was seated immediately. I adjusted my napkin and folded it once. Alyssa looked at the room, then back at me, and said nothing. Minutes stacked quietly. Not heavy. Not light. Just present. The piano continued at the same tempo. A candle flickered briefly, then steadied. I checked my watch. Century. 3 more minutes. The server returned to the next table. Not Ors. Smiling. Writing. Leaving. I placed my hands flat. Fingertips touching linen. Still waiting. Still seated. Still uncalled. The menu stayed closed. The water is untouched. Nothing outward changed except the sequence. I noted it. Not as an accusation. Only as a record. And stayed quiet. Waiting. Nothing changed at first. The menu stayed closed. The water stayed full. A server passed again and didn't stop. I checked my watch. And it was still the same minute. The kitchen doors opened. Then closed. Then opened again. A cart rolled by at the same speed as before. Alyssa looked at me. Then back at the room. She didn't say anything. A man stepped into the aisle near the center tables. His posture was different. Hands behind his back. No tray. No menu. He spoke quietly to a server without looking at us. The server nodded and moved on. The man stayed where he was, scanning the room slowly. Then his eyes reached our table and stayed there just long enough. He adjusted his jacket once and walked over. He stopped beside the table without pulling a chair. Good evening. 2 words. I nodded. Alyssa nodded too. I'm checking in. Short sentence. He looked at the closed menus. Then at the untouched water. Everything okay so far? Alyssa answered first. She spoke calmly. Yes. The word landed and stayed there. He waited a moment. I nodded again and didn't add anything. He smiled slightly. Not wide. Then straightened. We take our standards seriously. He let the sentence sit. I stayed quiet. He continued. Our guests expect a certain flow. He gestured lightly. Not at us. But toward the room. I followed the motion. Tables were filled. Servers moved smoothly. Sometimes seating takes adjustment. He stopped talking. The pause stayed. Alyssa placed her hands together on the table and kept them there. I didn't move. He glanced toward the host stand. Then back at us. May I confirm your reservation? I said our name again. At the same pace as before. He nodded but didn't write anything down. I'll double check. He turned and walked away. We stayed seated. The water stayed untouched. A dish arrived somewhere behind me with a soft clink. I checked my watch. Another minute gone. The man returned and stood in the same spot. Yes. One word. He nodded slightly to himself. It's in the system. He looked at the chair across from me. Then at the aisle behind us. This table may not be ideal. He waited again. I stayed still. Alyssa lifted her glass, took a small sip, then set it down. He continued. We try to maintain consistency. The word stayed in the air. Consistency. He gestured again toward the center tables. Those are better suited. I looked where he pointed. The empty tables near the windows were still empty. I didn't point them out. He cleared his throat quietly. I'm concerned this isn't the right fit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lower it either. I waited. Alyssa leaned forward just slightly. She spoke calmly. We're fine here. Her sentence ended clean. The man held his position. I understand. Another pause followed. Our space is curated. He said it slowly. I looked at the table again. The linen. The straight edges. Curated. He continued. Some guests prefer a different setting. His eyes moved past us toward the door. The meaning stayed unspoken. I shifted my hands once, then stopped. A server passed behind him and waited before moving on. The room continued working around us. He inhaled, then spoke again. I think it's best we find another arrangement. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. I looked at Alyssa. She looked back. Neither of us spoke. The man waited just long enough. I can recommend other options nearby. I stood. The chair moved slightly. Not loudly. Alyssa stood too. The man stepped back to clear the space. I appreciate your understanding. I nodded. Alyssa nodded. We picked up our coats. The menus stayed on the table. Closed. The water stayed full. As we walked past the host stand, the bell rang again. Another couple entered and was greeted immediately. We reached the door. I paused for a moment, then stepped outside. Street noise returned. Cars. Voices. Wind. The door closed behind us. The bell rang once more. We didn't turn around. After we stepped into the street that night, the door closed behind us, and the bell rang once more, then stopped. Traffic moved again. Wind pressed against coats. We walked without talking. 1 block. Then another. Stopping at a red light that didn't care who we were, Alyssa adjusted her sleeve. I checked my watch and slid my hand back into my pocket. We crossed when the light changed. The restaurant faded into reflections and parked cars. Nothing followed us home. No call. No message. The reservation email stayed where it was. On Monday morning, coffee cooled beside my laptop while spreadsheets opened. Alyssa worked from the next room. At noon, an email arrived from a Manhattan law firm. Short subject line, no greeting. A request for a confidential call. I read it twice, forwarded it, and we scheduled Wednesday morning. The call started on time. 2 attorneys appeared, files behind them, clean desks, measured pace. They asked about interest. Alyssa answered first and said we hadn't planned to acquire anything in Illinois. She said we were reviewing data. They asked about the visit. We described the sequence only. Arrival, wait, placement, interaction, exit, no adjectives, no labels. The attorneys took notes. They asked whether we would consider a purchase under specific conditions. I asked for numbers. They shared a range above market. They explained speed, a clean exit, no public statements, no advisory role for current ownership, and immediate operational authority for the buyer. We asked for documents. They sent them within the hour. By Friday, we were in New York. Papers spread across a long table. Dates read aloud. Clauses paused over. The signatures happened without ceremony. Back in Chicago, the transition followed the contract. On day 1, a meeting was scheduled before opening hours. Attendance required. Chairs filled the room. No music. White walls. A projector showed a flowchart instead of a speech. Arrival, greeting, seating, timing, escalation, accountability. Each step had a box. Each box had a name. When the chart reached management intervention, the room stayed still longer. The policy changed there. Any discretionary decision altering the guest sequence now requires documentation. Any request to move or remove a guest required a written reason, manager ID, and timestamp. No exceptions without a record. The change wasn't discussed. It was distributed. That afternoon, individual meetings began. The manager from the floor was called first. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. No raised voices. No stories. The log from that night was reviewed. Blank fields were visible. The decision was clear. He was removed from guest-facing duties effective immediately. His role ended at the close of the week. HR handled the paperwork. The process moved on. Next, the host stand logs were reviewed. Training gaps were identified. The host who followed the checklist without deviation stayed. The one who paused without documentation was reassigned to back-of-house training for 30 days. Paid, supervised, and evaluated weekly. Servers were called in next. Those who passed by without stopping were asked why. The answers were written down. No one was accused. The data spoke. 2 servers had followed the checklist exactly, offering water within the standard time and flagging delays. Their names were noted. They received a bonus on the next payroll cycle and were scheduled for advanced training. A lead server position opened. One of them filled it. The following week, new signage appeared behind the host stand. Not slogan, timers, average weight by table zone, real numbers. When the number turned red, a manager had to sign in. Training sessions ran early mornings. Chairs stayed empty during them. Questions were asked. Answers stayed short. Not everyone stayed. Some resigned quietly. Others adjusted. The restaurant reopened each night on time. The menu stayed. The lights stayed. The difference lived in sequence. We returned after 3 weeks. Same arrival time. Same door. The bell rang. The host asked for our name. Fingers moved. No pause. Right this way. We were seated by the window. Water arrived before we asked. A timer reset on the screen behind the stand. The server checked back once. Then again, on schedule. Later that month, reviews mentioned consistency. Not warmth. Not charm. Consistency. The word appeared again. Staff meetings included a standing agenda item. Accountability review. Names were read when metrics improved. Gift cards were handed out. Schedules were adjusted in favor of those who followed the process. When mistakes happened, they were logged and corrected without drama. One afternoon, a former manager emailed asking for a reference. HR responded with dates only. No commentary. That was the policy. At home. The old reservation email finally disappeared beneath new messages. We didn't archive it. It aged where it was. Months passed. Revenue stabilized. Turnover slowed. Complaints decreased. The system held. One evening, after closing, Alyssa asked whether we should talk about it publicly. I said responsibility doesn't need volume. Reward doesn't need a spotlight. She nodded. If you stayed with this to the end, you saw what happens when accountability is clear and recognition is earned. Systems don't change by speeches. They change by consequences and incentives aligned to behavior. If you want more stories about leadership, power, and what accountability actually looks like when it's enforced without noise, subscribe to Black CEO Tales.